Come on in, you guys. We got a brand new episode of Jimmy Rants in store for you here today. JimmyRants.com is the website, and as always, you can engage live in the content, but you got to go follow me. I'm over on Instagram at Livin' Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you are there, you can engage like Linton and Nathalie and so many people coming in right this very moment, right here on Jimmy Rants. We also simulcast over on my Facebook page, so thank you guys for being here today, as well as on YouTube Live. We added this about a week and a half ago, a couple weeks ago, and it's been wonderful having you guys here as part of the discussion. If you missed a live here on Instagram Live, you can watch it on replay for up to 24 hours. After 24 hours, we do move all the videos over to JimmyRants.com, as well as over on YouTube. Type in a keyword Jimmy Rants over on YouTube and you will find the show. And on Tuesdays on my podcast called the Livin' La Vida Low Carb Show, we do air audio of the best moments of here on Jimmy Rants there. And that's been very well received since we started doing that. LLVLC.com. All right, guys. So you know, I often talk about research here on Jimmy Rants. I like to look at the studies that come out. I like to see what is making news in the world of health, and especially as it relates to nutritional health. And oftentimes you'll see a salacious headline, red meat leads to cancer and even death. You know, and you see those kind of headlines. And of course, the first thing that most of us do when we see a headline like that is kind of roll our eyes. Okay, yeah, right. And then you start looking at the research and you kind of go, okay, they're showing associations, and through that association, they're coming to a conclusion about what the study meant. And of course, what I've often talked about is not all studies are created equal. I have mentioned this before. In fact, I did a whole Jimmy Rants on why epidemiological studies are far inferior to a well-formulated randomized controlled clinical trial. Those tend to be kind of the gold standard when it comes to research. Unfortunately, most of those kind of research papers are few and far between, and most of what we get is epidemiology. And so sometimes in the reporting of studies, you get inflated, exaggerated conclusions when you read about it in like a newspaper or something online. So I often tell people, don't just look at a headline about a study. That's ridiculous. Like, why would you that's like reading a book and judging a book, the entirety of hundreds of pages of a book, simply by looking at the front cover. You know, and that old saying is don't judge a book by its cover. It's true all the more so when it comes to research. And unfortunately, we are a very headline-driven society. People will come to conclusion. You know people like this in your life. They will read a headline that says, vitamin C will prevent cancer. And so what do people do? They don't even read the article. They don't even look at the journal of the study and look for all the ins and outs of the veracity of the study. They simply see a headline, vitamin C cures cancer. There's no such study, by the way. But if they did, somebody would see that. See, I heard vitamin C will cure cancer. And so, you just start taking the supplement willy-nilly. You know you have people in your life that they're that way. And science isn't about headlines. Science isn't about making these bombastic claims. Media is. Media is all about the headline. The media is always wanting eyeballs. And so if they give you a salacious headline to get you to read the article, then that's their job. That's what they're trying to accomplish. But you need to know that. And so perhaps you've seen reporting on research, looking at studies, and it's an exaggerated response. Like, for people that have been in this for a little while, I've been looking at this kind of stuff for 15 years. I have seen it over and over and over again, where you see a headline and then you start reading the actual story and you realize the headline way overblew the conclusions of the study. And so I have an article here today, along with this really great infographic that was a part of the article, about how to spot bad science. We'll get to that here in just a moment. But this article is from questioning-answers.blogspot.com. And it's all about inflated press releases about science. Because we're seeing it. Exaggerated research, study press releases can come from bad science. So if it's a bad research where the quality of the science is not that great, and then they write a press release that exaggerates some of the conclusions made in the study, and then those exaggerations in the press releases then become a part of the narrative in the reporting. Because here is what a reporter does. They get a press release about a new study and they go, ooh, that. And they look for some part to put into the headline that's going to capture people's attention. Now, whether the research is valid or not, whether the point in the press release that's talking about the research, whether it's true or not, the reporter doesn't give a rip. The reporter simply says, okay, that sounds interesting enough. It's clickbaity. Let me make it in the headline. And sometimes reporters try to report accurately, but then an editor above him says, no, we need a salacious headline to get eyeballs. And then they change the headline to something that's totally different than what the actual study said. And so that's real. That's more often than not how things go. But let me read from this. The headline, beware the inflated science-related press release. And so it talks about exaggeration in news is strongly associated with exaggeration in press releases when it comes to the media reporting of some of the health-related science news. So the idea behind a study which was done on this, which has been summarized pretty well in various media, was to look at the contribution of the press release. So the whole purpose of a press release is to get your attention in the press room. They want to get the message out about their study because eyeballs of people seeing your research means more interest in your research, therefore more interviews for the researchers to be on various programs, and that's how it works. The look at me part of the science publishing is what the press release is, to those sometimes inflated health science headlines, which we all encounter on a day-to-day basis. Is your first inclination when you see a health headline to automatically believe it? Now, maybe not you guys, because you watch Jimmy Rants and you're skeptical and you've got kind of some of that built-in BS meter stuff going on. But for a lot of people, they see simply a headline and they go no further. And they predicate every bit of their belief system. Well, I heard a research paper said XYZ. And then, whenever I encounter people that, well, research says, okay, where was it published? They don't know. Who is the author of the study? I don't know. What was the primary conclusions made in the abstract? I don't know. They're not actually looking at study. They're looking at reporting from a press release of a study. Now, do you know how diluted that is? D-I-L-U-T-E-D. But it's also D-E-L-U-D-E-D as well. But it's diluted, looking at research. When your sole source of information is a headline of a press release about a study that may or may not have actually told you what's in the study. It's why whenever I talk about research, I always say, go look at the original study. At least look at the abstract and see the methodology, see the analysis, and then look at the actual conclusion the researchers made, not what some journalist decided to put in a headline, because that's the reality there. The results of the study of these press releases suggest that while some journalists and editors might need a refresher course on the basics of science, such as probability and risk, academic press offices and even the very academics behind the research might also need to shoulder some of the responsibility, bearing in mind correlation is not causation. Sometimes a researcher knows their research didn't really show a whole lot, but in order to amplify what they did find, they do statistical magic. So sometimes that's where the taking of the probability and risk and the percentage of difference between factors, the changes that happen versus like the relative changes that happen. And so you can mess with some percentages to make things seem like they're a bigger deal than they are. And that we see it all the time in nutritional health and in the research that comes out and in the reporting of that research. And it's unfortunate because people buy into these salacious claims without digging any deeper. You guys know I dig deeper, and yet it doesn't happen that often. For example, a mouse study that correlates the presence of compound X with improvement in the mouse condition Y, it's interpreted as meaning that compound X is the elixir of life for all of humanity. That's the other thing. There's a lot of extrapolation of science that comes out of animal-based models like a mouse study, or even comes out an extrapolation out of like an epidemiological study where they didn't actually look at patients. They just looked at data. And in the animal model, they just look at a mouse and see how a mouse responds. And then they say, well, if a mouse gets diabetes from doing this, then humans get diabetes too. And that's not what that research is for. Animal-based models are a fantastic way to test what could happen in a human. So you observe what happens in a mouse, in a study, and you get the conclusion. Then that conclusion suddenly becomes the theory of what will happen in humans. And so then you test that same protocol that you did with the mouse in a human to see if you get replication of the results or something different. But you wouldn't know what would happen until you did the mouse model first. Or in the case of epidemiology, when you see these correlations between data points, again, it sets a theory for you to test in a randomized controlled trial, and that's how you do it. Unfortunately, randomized controlled trials are few and far between. They primarily look at epidemiology and or animal models, usually mice, and then they try to make a conclusion for humans, and you just can't do that. But they do it all the time. We should instantly rush out and buy as much of this elixir of life as possible when we see it happen in a mouse, but always look to the press release before you blame the newspaper. So, press releases, you guys, we often criticize reporting of science, but we have to blame the academia that's putting out the press releases and sometimes the researchers themselves. They know their research was a whole lot of nothing. But in order to justify all the money they're getting for the research and to keep the coffers full of money so they can do more of their bogus research, they have to make it look like it was a big deal. And I did a reporting on a study the other day. Kevin Hall, he did a 2-week study of keto versus a plant-based. And of course, he got lots of money from the NIH for that study. And he made such a big splash trying to make a big deal out of a lot of insignificant things. And yet he got exactly what he wanted. And in the press release about it, I'm sure they exaggerated a lot of things. All right. So here are some key things to pay attention to. Post-publication peer review is mentioned somewhere in the text. Although this is traditionally meant to imply that researchers who have a beef about a study or interpretation of results send a letter to the publishing journal outlining their issues, there are quite a few other mediums these days which seem to get the job done just as well. So on blogs, that's a big thing. On social media, they can get their message out. I dare say someone somewhere might eventually start a blog titled Pressing Ahead, Press Release versus Actual Results, if that's not already been done. Other social media might also play a role in highlighting the discrepancy. So here's the thing. A press release is put out about a study, and it's got a lot of discrepancies about what the actual research showed. Okay? But then other people say, well, wait a minute, that's not what that research showed. So they're throwing it out on social media about that same study that you're getting the salacious headline about, or they're writing a blog post that corrects a lot of the misinformation. I wish that would be something people could just readily go to and have basically a fact check type of website that would take a look at any given study that comes out and actually give you the lowdown on what the study actually showed and what it means and what its application is. Wouldn't you like that kind of website? Now that would be quite the undertaking for someone. You would definitely have to specialize it in various areas. So in my realm, you would need to have like all the nutritional health studies related to low carb diets and have someone kind of do that for just low carb diet types of research, because otherwise you'd get overwhelmed with so many all the time. So they're leaving out of this the very important variable in this scientific producer-consumer relationship, and that's the consumer, you guys. You might well scoff that anyone without a PhD or related qualification just doesn't understand the science. Those of you that are lay people, myself included, have you ever just been told, well, this is over your head, you don't understand science, you just need to stay in your lane, you just need to not pay attention to things you just don't understand? Trust me, I've had that thrown in my face many a times. But he says here in this blog post, but you would be wrong. Although there are people out there who actually believe the term scientifically proven as if God himself endorsed it, I'd suggest there are enough people who don't believe every headline that they read, and they're vocal enough to say something about it, yours truly included. Search engines like Google do a good job of ensuring that anyone looking up a scientific claim that's important to them quickly get both sides of the story. I'm not so sure Google does a good job with that. We know they've been silencing voices of dissent, especially in the nutritional health realm, for a good while. And I did Jimmy Rants last year about how they changed their algorithm to make a lot of us in the alternative health space harder to find than we were before. An inflated press release, which is generally detectable on the web, will probably not stay inflated for long, probably less so after other research starts to come out. So, how do you determine what the bad science is? That's the golden question. People are often like, I just don't know how to make heads or tails of this. I'm just trying to live my life, and I'm reading a headline, and it doesn't make any sense with my own experience. So I've seen headlines along the lines of, well, if you eat a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diet, it's going to increase your risk of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and all-cause mortality, which is death. And you've seen those kinds of headlines put out there often. And so what do you do when you start seeing research making headlines like that? You go right to the research and you try to determine, okay, what is the quality of the science that I'm looking at? Where do they come to these conclusions? So I have this nice little infographic. Again, it is from a website, this one here, compoundchem.com. So compound, C-O-M-P-O-U-N-D, chem is C-H-E-M, as in chemistry.com. And so this is from 2014, the person that made this infographic, very beautiful infographic, all about how to read and spot bad science. You ready for this? This was really good. So there's 12 different things here that are the elements of spotting bad science. So this is going to help you the next time you go to look up some study to determine whether it's good science or not. So number one, sensationalized headline. That is your first telltale sign that it's probably bad science. Headlines of articles are commonly designed to entice viewers to click on it, clickbait, and to read the article. At best, they oversimplify the findings of research. At worst, they tend to sensationalize and misrepresent them. I have many times seen a headline and looked up the research, and I've gone right to the lead researcher. And usually on most of these papers in these journals, they will not only list the name of the lead researcher, they will actually give you their email address. So I encourage you to do this sometime. If something just doesn't smell right about a study, and you look at it and you're just like, I don't know, that just seems like a bombastic claim. Write to the researcher. You'll be surprised how many of these researchers will write you back and go, oh yeah, that's not my conclusion at all. That was simply the reporting of what I did in my study. That's not my conclusion. And so even a lot of these researchers don't like the way they're being reported on. So if something doesn't seem right, immediately when it looks like a sensationalistic headline, keto will cause you to die tomorrow. Well, of course you're not going to, believe that. Go look up the science. Go look deeper. And worst case scenario, write specifically to that author of that study, and they'll be happy to tell you, oh, here's what the conclusions actually said. So that's your first clue of looking for bad science. If you just joined us, we're going over 12 different things to look for to spot and identify bad science so you don't get fooled when you see something in the media. So number one, sensationalized headline. Number two, misinterpreted results. News articles sometimes will distort or misrepresent the findings of research just for the sake of having a good story. Remember, the media is not interested in reporting. They're interested in eyeballs. They want you to read their article. And the longer you're on their website, and maybe they have clickable links within that story for you to go to other parts of their website. That is what the media does. So they will do something with the study results that will misinterpret what the original intention of the study authors wanted. And you got to know this going into reading a story about a study. And remember, if you missed it earlier, they're not just reporting on a study. They're reporting on a press release about a study. So they're not even looking at the actual study. They're just looking at press releases and pulling chunks out of there that they think will make a salacious headline. And then they use math to try to make some kind of a results look like it's a big deal, when a lot of times it's not. So they can do this intentionally or not. If possible, try to go back to the original research paper rather than rely on the article itself. So when I read a study article, so it's a news report on a study, the first thing I do is I go to the bottom of that news report, and usually there's a clickable link to get to the study itself. If there's not, they usually give you the name of the journal that it's in and the date of the publication. You can go find it. Everything just about is available through a search online. And you should look at that original paper so you don't misinterpret the results. Number three, conflicts of interest. This is a big one, you guys. Many companies employ scientists to carry out and publish their own research. While this does not necessarily invalidate the research, it should be analyzed with this in mind. Research can also be misrepresented for personal or financial gain. I'll give you a real life example of this one. So there was a study that talked about eating breakfast helped you eat less calories and thus led to more weight loss when you had breakfast. Well, you look at the researcher and you realize they have ties and the funding from cereal companies, Kellogg's. And so Kellogg's pays this guy to say that eating breakfast makes you eat less calories and thus will help you lose weight. And there's no special interest involved there? Like, really? They want us to believe that? But no, how many people look for these conflicts of interest? Now, again, I don't think the funding in and of itself means that it's tainted research. But trust me, if they found that eating Cheerios for breakfast did not lead to weight loss or eating less calories and if they found that conclusion, they would not have published the study. The only reason that they put out the study is to verify something that would be beneficial to Kellogg's. Now, I don't know. I don't eat cereal anymore. Does Kellogg's make Cheerios? Who makes Cheerios? I don't know. Who cares? But there are conflicts of interest involved is the main point. Number four, correlation versus causation. Be wary of confusion about a correlation in data and it being the cause of something that happens. Correlation between two variables does not automatically mean that it causes the other. Global warming has increased since the 1800s and pirate numbers have decreased, but lack of pirates did not cause global warming. I remember Chris Masterjohn did something about cholesterol with this, that the number of people that had higher cholesterol that led to a heart attack was correlated with the number of people that bought albums by Justin Bieber. You can correlate a lot of numbers, but it doesn't mean it caused that. So this is a very common tactic of looking at simple correlations, and especially in epidemiological studies, they look for those correlations so that they could then say, well, because this happens again and again, and we see it happen here, and this disease process happens here, it must be the reason why. And guys, that's just plain bad science. Very, very bad science. Number 5, speculative language. Oh, see if this sounds familiar. Speculations from research are just that, speculation. Look for words such as may, could, might, and other words, as it is unlikely the research provides hard evidence for any conclusions they proceed. I guarantee you look at most research, you're almost always going to see may, could, or might. And those are simply speculations of the researcher saying, oh God, please, because I need this research, I need more money for my lab, and please, it may do it, but I need more research. And that's the other thing. More research is needed. It's like, okay, you did this study to try to create the evidence for some theory that you have. And then you say, well, it may, could be. And then you're like, but we need more research. How often does that happen? A lot more than you think. Number 6, the sample size is way too small. If you're doing a study trying to make a conclusion about something and you're only looking at 7 people, are you really doing a great job? Even if it's a randomized controlled trial, 7 people? No. In a randomized controlled clinical trial, you probably need at least 50 to 100 people for it to be pretty valid. The Kevin Hall study the other day, by the way, that I mentioned on Jimmy Rants, that one had 20 people. A little bit small for a randomized trial, especially as short a duration as his was. But you need enough numbers to make it significant and to have a cross-section of the population. Otherwise, it's invalid. And so sample size being too small, in a trial, the smaller a sample size, the lower the confidence in the results from that sample. But again, when it gets reported on, they don't say that it's a small study. They might mention, well, a study of 10 people found blah, 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 blah. And you almost kind of go 10 people. But how many actually people look at that? It's just 10 people. No, they look at the conclusion. They look at the headline. And that's why it can be considered bad science. Conclusions drawn should be considered with this in mind, the small number. Though in some cases small samples are unavoidable, it may be a cause for suspicion if a large sample was possible but avoided. I'll give you an example of a small sample that was impossible to avoid. There was a study within the keto realm where they were trying to look at the effects of a ketogenic diet on those who had significant stage 4 cancer. I remember Dr. Richard Feynman and Eugene Fine were doing this research probably around 5 or 6 years ago. And they wanted to see if implementing a very strategic, very low carb, very high fat ketogenic approach would help improve these cancers at all. So they got 10 people in the study. And in those particular people, they were the worst of the worst. Pretty much chemotherapy wasn't working. Mainstream medicine had given up on them, pretty much left them for dead. So trying to find those kind of patients, 10 was a big deal. So they got 10 people and they found some pretty good improvement in a few. They saw some stabilization in others, and then others got worse and died. So, but they couldn't do more than 10 because it was difficult in that circumstance. But if you've got an obvious pool of people that you could have included in a study and you didn't, then you look like you're purposely keeping it small in order to manipulate the results. Another sign of bad science. Number 7, unrepresentative samples. In a human trial, researchers will try to select individuals that are representative of a larger population. If the sample is different from the population as a whole, then the conclusions may well be different. So here's what happens. Sometimes they want to try to conclude what happens across a population. Sometimes they only want to look at obese people. Sometimes they only want to look at type 2 diabetics. Sometimes they only want to look at people with like an autoimmune disease. But most of the time when they're doing general research, they're looking at a cross-section of the population, which would include all of those people that I just mentioned, along with normal weight people, along with healthy people, along with athletes. So you kind of get a cross section. But if they stack the deck with a bunch of sick people, and then they say, well, look what happened to these very sick people, therefore we extrapolate it for the whole population, I'll tell you where this came into play. A lot of studies were done in the 1920s on epileptic children and a ketogenic diet. And in the 1920s, ketogenic diet was very rudimentary at that time. And they were trying to feed these kids very high fat. And they were kind of working their way through trying to figure out nutritional ketosis and how it would help in the management of epilepsy. Well, these kids were super sick with their epileptic seizures. And some of them developed some side effects from their illness, not from the ketogenic diet, but from their illness. Well, in the data, they reported these side effects. So then flash forward 90, 100 years later, keto starts to get popular. I remember I was at a paleo conference, Paleo FX, I think it was 2014, and Sarah Ballantyne decided to take some of that data from the 1920s where they were looking at very sick epileptic children, and she titled her talk, Why the Ketogenic Diet is Dangerous. And she started going through all of this data from the 1920s of these very sick epileptic children and saying, see, this is what happens when you put people on a ketogenic diet. And so therefore, if you eat keto today, this is what's going to happen to you. And I remember like raising my hand and at the end of her talk and going, how in the world do you extrapolate the data from very sick epileptic children and then suddenly apply it to relatively healthy people in the modern age? You can't. And yet that's what she tried to do. And if you look at an unrepresentative sample and try to make a conclusion about the entirety of the population, you're going to get skewed results. I hate bad science, but it's out there prevalent, you guys, even from people who are seemingly smart. Number 8, no control group is used. In clinical trials, results from test subjects should be compared to a control group not given the substance being tested. Groups should also be allocated randomly. In general experiments, a control test should be used where all variables are controlled. I mentioned this the other day when I was reporting on the Kevin Hall study. He needed to have a control group that did not eat super low carb, did not eat super high carb. He should have looked at a third group that would have been a control of more like a zone diet, kind of a 33, 33, 33 of fat, protein, carbs. And that would have been an interesting control group just to see what happens when you're not doing one of these two extreme types of the diets. But he didn't do it. No control group. It's a big deal. Number 9, no blind testing used. In order to prevent bias, subjects should not know if they are in the test or the control group. In double-blind testing, even researchers would not know which group subjects are in until after testing. Blind testing isn't always feasible or ethical. And I know Kevin Hall's study was not blinded. He knew exactly who was in which wing of the study and when. And it just sets things up for bias to come in. And when you're trying to do good quality research, bias is the antithesis of good quality science. It is. And so you have to be blind tested. And double blind is even better. The patient doesn't know it. The study participant doesn't know that they're whether they're in the control group or in the actual test group. And the researcher doesn't know. That's what double blind means. And if you don't do that, you get skewed results. Number 10, cherry-picked results. This involves selecting data from experiments which supports the conclusion of the research while ignoring those that do not. If a research paper draws conclusions from a selection of its results, not all of them, then it's considered cherry picking. One of the most famous ones within the keto space is the so-called 7-country study by Ancel Keys. So this was research that looked at various countries. They were trying to make the connection that eating saturated fat raised your cholesterol levels and thus you got heart disease. And so Ancel Keys went around the world and he looked at various populations and he found 26 different countries and tried to make a correlation. Well, unfortunately, when he started to do that, he did not find that it was a perfect little graph that showed people who ate the most saturated fat raised their cholesterol and thus got heart disease. That's not at all what happened, because he went to France. They ate a crap load of saturated fat, but very little heart disease. And then he went to other countries where they ate very low fat, and yet they got heart disease. So what he did was, okay, well, let's do this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. 7 studies out of those 26 studies. And then he made his nice little graph that proved his theory. And guys, that happens more often than you realize. They cherry pick the data that fits their theory because, again, they're trying to be funded. They're trying to make a splash in the scientific world. And Ansel Keys did that. And by the way, that study, which was extremely flawed in the 1950s, was what eventually got the attention of George McGovern, who then started the dietary guidelines in 1980, which we still live with today. And it's still based on the flawed science that Ansel Keys did 50, 60 years ago. You see why bad science needs to be corrected? And it's why I'm doing this Jimmy Rants here today. I want you to know, when you're getting bad science, there are ramifications of it unless it is easily corrected. Now, thankfully, we live in an information age. We have beautiful social media like we have here that you can have people articulate these kinds of things. Of course, social media, typing things out and having links to post and blah, blah, blah. Information is at our fingertips. So back in the 1950s when Ansel Keys came out with his, he was able to do it in the shadows of the dark and nobody was calling him out on it. But now we have hindsight being 2020. We can see the manipulation that he did, cherry picking the results. Number 11, unreplicable results. So the key in science is being able to take an experiment, get a conclusion, and then have other researchers, and even the same researcher, replicate the same experiment and get the same results. Results should be replicable by independent research, tested over a wide range of conditions where possible to ensure that they're not being generalized, or they are being generalized, Extraordinary claims require much more extraordinary evidence, much more than just one independent study. So if you see a study that comes to a conclusion, you go, okay, let me see if anybody else has done this exact same protocol and gotten different results. Because if you get the same protocol and you get the same result, you do the same protocol, you do the same result, another researcher does the same protocol, gets the same result, at some point the mountain of evidence starts to build that when you do X, Y happens. But unfortunately, sometimes when you do X, Y happens in one singular study, they try to make a big deal about that one study. And I'm thinking, no. One study means nothing in the research realm. In the scientific realm, you have to look at something, X that led to Y, and then make sure X always leads to Y in all these other studies. And if it doesn't lead to Y in the other studies, then you try to figure out, okay, what was different than the other experiment? That's what good science does. So if you can't replicate those results, it's another sign of bad science. And the last one, journals and citations. Research published to major journals will have undergone a review process, but they can still be flawed, so should still be evaluated with these points in mind. Large numbers of citations do not always indicate that research is highly regarded. This is a good point too. A lot of times in studies, at the very end, you'll always see the citations of other research that's doing things along the same realm. The problem is you get one bad research paper, and then that research paper then gets cited at the end of another research paper, which then that bad science then gets cited with the original one, and then there. And so before long, you have 50 citations at the end of a study, all of them being predicated on bad science, and you got a Mel of a Hess on your hands because you're citing bad science after bad science after bad science to try to legitimize your current science, which again is bad science. You see how this game works? It's pretty interesting. So I hope this was educational, you guys. Exaggerated research study press releases can come from this bad science that we're talking about. So when you read a headline and you see some claim, I don't care if it's for or against keto. I've seen some people in the carnivore community recently citing bad science, but just because it makes meat look good. I'm like, no. We need to stay consistent, you guys. If you think the bad science on the end of anti-keto, anti-meat, anti-low-carb diets is bad, then you also need to be repulsed by the ones that make keto, meat, and low-carb look good. I'm not a fan of either side of that coming from bad science. Show me the good science, and then let's talk. All right, let's see what you guys have to say. We're going to come over here to Instagram Live first, then we'll pop over to Facebook, and then finally we'll go to YouTube Live. Thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. All right, let's see what you guys have to say. Rachel says, yes, do it. Mom from Detroit, we absolutely have to do our own research when it comes to these research studies. We have to put the time in for our health and our peace. And unfortunately, Mom from Detroit, thank you for that. I don't know how many people have the wherewithal to spend that kind of time. Obviously, those of us in this space make the time because we see the value in it. But a lot of people are like, well, I'm just trying to live my life. Why do I care what a study has to say? Well, if you're predicating your life on information that's found in a headline, and even if you read the article about the study, go back even further. It doesn't take that much time, maybe 5-10 minutes to look at an abstract of a study and look what the researchers actually showed, not what they want you to see. Now, sometimes people are like, well, I'm not scientific minded, and they use all this jargon that I don't understand. That's when you come to people like me and others and go, okay, help me understand this. I'm more than happy to help you guys. You write me a message on a DM. I will be happy to try to help interpret where I can. I'm definitely not scientifically trained. I'm not any kind of PhD or MD, but I'm pretty well adept at science, looking at it and understanding what the relevant points are. So thank you for that comment. All right, thank you, Instagram Live. Let's pop over here to my Facebook page, see what you guys have to say. What's up, guys? All right, what you got for me? Kira says, it's funny how when I ask friends where the proof is on their claim, they don't feel compelled to go any further, but I mentioned something and we don't need carbs for fuel, or such as we don't need carbs for fuel, and that we can eat saturated fat. These same people want me to have actual science to prove what I'm saying about low carb, high fat. There is a bit of a double standard, isn't it, Kira, where you challenge them on their claims and they don't really have anything further than maybe a headline or an article that they read. But then when you do have something that's legit, now they want the science of it all. So bit of a double standard, that's for sure. All right, Tommy says, new to your channel here in OKC. Great info. Thank you, Tommy. Appreciate you watching here on Jimmy Rants. We do simulcast here on Facebook and YouTube. The main show is over here on Instagram Live. So check us out sometime. Living Low Carb Man over there. All right, let's see what my YouTubers have to say about this one. Tupa says, hello, what's your opinion on diet and the seasons? That's a general question, which I answer general questions on my Ask Me Anything segment on Fridays. So come back tomorrow and you can ask your question 11 a.m. Eastern time. I don't answer general questions when I'm doing a specific topic, but thank you for that. Kira says, I like to run experiments on myself. I guess they call that biohacking. It is biohacking. I tried carnivore for 5 days. Love how I felt. I don't really need a vegan meat-hating research paper to tell me not to do it. Well, and that's the other thing here. Not all research is applicable. Like some people feel like, okay, well, I need to read this research and the research says that eating meat's too much for your body to handle. You need to switch to a plant-based diet. Now, who's going to actually do that? Now, give me the compelling randomized controlled clinical trial and you will get my attention. I will take a very close look at any RCT that makes a nutritional health claim. Unfortunately, most RCTs are non-existent when it comes to nutritional health. They're expensive to do. I remember Gary Taubes one time said, in order to really prove the veracity of a low-carb ketogenic diet in a randomized controlled double-blind placebo blah, 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 blah type of study, that study is going to cost at minimum $100 million to do, because you've got to lock people up in a metabolic ward for at least a year and maybe 2 years. You need to feed them specifically a very low carb, moderate protein, high fat diet to produce ketones. Then you need to have a control group where they don't really change anything about their diet. Then you need to have a third group that would be more of a low carb plant based over that same period of time. And then you track all these various markers on a very sophisticated level. That's at least $100 million to do that. Like, think about if you go to a study participant, potential one, and you say, hey, look, I'm going to have to lock you up in a room with a bunch of other people, and we control what you eat and how much you eat and how long you eat and blah, 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 for a year, 2 years. How much would that take to lock you up for a year or two? Most people would be like, yeah, give me $1 million. How many people would you need to do that with? 100? So you lock 100 people up in a metabolic ward for a year. Let's just say a year. And they demand having $1 million for that. Now, some might take $500,000, some might take $250,000, whatever. But you'd have to pay a significant amount of money for those 100 people. And that's just for the study participants. And then on top of that, you've got all the medical people that would be involved tracking. You've got all the testing and the costs involved with the testing that you would be doing on a constant daily basis. You'd be tracking these things, and it's expensive. And so his $100 million is probably way, way low. You're probably looking at $500 million to do that kind of a study. And who's going to pay for that? Where does that money come from? The NIH is not going to pay for that. It would have to come from some kind of organization that would be committed to having that volume of money available to do that long of a study. And you really need it to be at least a year to really be of veracity in the scientific world. So that's the challenge here. All right, let's come back to Instagram, see if there's any other comments. Rachel says, I don't understand how people even open the clickbait studies, and then on top of that, they believe it. Oh, it's our society, Rachel. You know this as good as anybody, that when people see a headline, it lights fires up in their head. They've actually had people wear these things on their head while they're reading headlines. And when they see one that's really interesting, it lights up their head. So clickbait is a thing. And they click on that headline. And sometimes all they see is the headline, and they automatically believe what's in the headline without going further. And even if you do go further, you get this salaciousness of the press release in the story itself and not the actual study. Now, you and I have been awoken to how you need to dig deeper, but not everybody does. I would dare say the vast majority of people look at the headline, another kind of sub-segment of that population that just looks at the headline and believes it, then they read the actual article, and then another very small subset of that then goes and looks at the original research. Very rare do you have people do that whole process of going all the way to the end. So guys, I hope this was educational to you, that you understand that there are a lot of things at play when you see headlines out there that are reporting on studies and research. It's not always as it seems. That's it for this episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. As always, come engage live. We won't bite you, I promise. Not too hard. Over on Instagram at Livin' Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you are there, engage live. Had a great show here today. Thank you guys for being here. We also simulcast over on my Facebook page as well as on YouTube Live. So thank you all for being here today on Jimmy Rants. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay for up to 24 hours on Instagram. After that, we do pop it on over to JimmyRants.com. So go check out all the past episodes there. And then over on YouTube, type in a keyword Jimmy Rants. You will find the show. So guys, that's it for now. Until next time, we'll see you then.